welcome to ClockTower Game Studios. Today, I was originally going to be modifying and making a couple pieces of scatter terrain using some toy cars purchased at a local department store off the clearance rack. Now, the cars were only like $4, $5 a piece. They weren't too expensive. You can find them cheaper when they're on sale. They're pretty good detail. The scale's a little wonky depending on the minis you use. But as you can see, I was planning to just use my other tiles, the granite countertop samples that I've got there as my bases, and I'm gonna just make some scatter terrain for the streets with these. Like I was saying, you can see here that the scale on them is a little bit off, but not too bad, especially with some of the bigger size models. Infinity apparently uses much closer to true 28mm scale, while Games Workshop and other games have kind of moved towards a 32mm, and they're a lot closer for the 32mm, as you can see here. So straight off the shelf, these things have a really high gloss finish that I didn't like. So the first thing I decided to do was take some masking tape and mask off the windows, and then I'm going to spray them down with some matte clear coat to kind of dull down that really glossy, deep finish. I want them to look more like, they've been in like the early stages of a war zone, so they're going to be a little bit dusty. They're not going to be quite as shiny and look like they're fresh off the factory floor. So here I'm just carefully taking some blue painter's tape, and I'm using my fingernail to kind of dig them into the window recesses. So I make sure that I'm getting into the windows. I want the windows to remain clear, but I want all the other details to be dusty and matte down a little bit. So that's what I'm doing here. I'm just carefully using my hobby knife to press that down into the recess a little more and then cut it out. And I'm just going to go around and do that all the way around both models. So here you can see both finished models with all the painter's tape on. As you can tell, I've done the headlights, the taillights, all the glass all the way around. That way it maintains that glassy, clear finish as much as possible. So moving on. So this is when things kind of start to go sideways. So the first thing I decided to do is I got my brand new rotary tool, which was a little cheap thing from Harbor Freight, which is going to be good for some applications, but just wasn't up to the task of taking care of these die-cast metal models. So that's kind of unfortunate, but here you can see the models have been clear coated with the matte finish. The windows are still clear though, because I was careful with the painter's tape. And now the next thing to do is just to dig in and start taking them apart, because I wanted to start tearing them down so they were easier to work with cutting open. My theory here was to cut open the hood and have the smoke coming out just from the engine compartment, but things go sideways here. After getting the bottom off the car and having just the frame in hand with the doors, I noticed that both the door assemblies, the hinges, the dash assembly, the headlights, the headlight lenses, all of it is secured to where the hood would be. So I put that aside and come back to this, and the first thing I do with this is, since it's going to be glued down, I don't want the wheels to turn, so I just grab a thing of super glue and fill up both the gearbox and around all the axles with super glue. It's not the best hold because it'll shear off if it's actually somebody really tries to roll it, so the axles will still roll and the wheels will still turn. But for the purposes of being able to work on it a little easier, being able to just glue these solid was a good first step. So my thinking here was, since all this is secured to the hood, the next thing I need to do is secure all of the windows to the actual chassis. So I just took my super glue, and since this is going to be a smoking, burnt out car, or at least an abandoned car, it wouldn't matter overly much if some of the glass was foggy from the super glue. So I just go around and I add a very liberal amount of super glue around the edges where the plastic meets the metal frame. My thinking was, like I said, this will hold it in place even after I take it off of the hood out and get that connection, what holds it all together. If I take all that out, it'll still be fine. That's what I was thinking anyway. And here is where things really start to go real bad. So I had my rotary tool going and I'm trying to cut through The hood, which apparently is thicker metal than I had imagined and a lot more sturdy than I had imagined, and my budget rotary tool was not working as well as I had hoped. So this didn't work, and I wasted probably a solid hour, hour and a half trying to make it work, which was a mistake. So next time, there's some lessons learned here. So I decide to go ahead and take the doors and the dash out and hoping maybe I can get a better angle on cutting through this thing from the inside. But I get so frustrated with it that once I get the doors and everything off, I just decide to move back to working with the wheelbase. So the first thing I want to do with the frame, really the only thing I want to do with it, is I want to make one of the back tires flat. Maybe that's why it was abandoned and left in the street. So the first thing I do is I start a score as deep as I can into the rubber wheel, just inside of where it would meet the ground normally on the outside edge. So I make a deep gash there, and then I do the same thing on the inside edge, and then I take and I kind of just try to fillet that off. As you can see here, I just work the blade carefully against the rubber. This really wasn't that easy. The rubber was more resilient than I expected it to be. My blade may have been a little dull. Either way, between the two, this took a little more effort and time than I was prepared for it to. But it turned out okay. The finished result looks all right. Not my favorite result, but good enough. It conveys what I wanted it to well enough. So after stepping away for a minute and taking care of one of the easy steps, I come back at this and I fight with this thing for probably the next hour and get nowhere. I make a bunch of cutting. I cut both sides of the hood. I cut along the front of the hood. I get on the inside and start trying to cut out some of the supports that are at the back where the hinges for the doors are. I start cutting into that a little bit and testing that, and that doesn't get me very far. So this part of the project kind of hit a dead end, and I ended up even went as far as to take a hammer and an awl to it, hoping maybe I could punch through it in some places to weaken it up and then cut through it easier, and that didn't work out. So I was really getting frustrated with it and kind of stepped back for a minute to catch my breath and, take another look at it and figure out what to do. Rather than continuing to struggle with this, what I decided to do is just to kind of hide all of my sins with the polyfill smoke that I'm making. So I did this much in the same way that I did the smoke from the barrel in the last video. I took my polyfill, which is basically seamstress pillow stuffing type stuff, and I just kind of fluffed it out and kind of puffed it and stretched it to make it look a little wispy, and then I kind of shaped it in the way I wanted. And once I had it shaped how I wanted, I took it outside, hit it with the black rattle can of just plain black matte paint until I left the top edge more of a grayish light white color and more wispy, and then the bottom edge where the smoke is boiling out from the hood, I did a much darker black, full-on black. And I did 3 parts for that. I did both the windows and the doors. They all had parts for it. And then I put the car back together. I did that off camera because it wasn't exciting or any real hobby related. And then I started gluing everything kind of in place where I wanted it. I wanted the passenger side door to be a little bit open. I didn't want it to be closed completely, so I filled in around the hinge with more super glue and kind of packed it in there just to make sure that that door stayed just a hair open. And then I realized at this point that things had not gone well. As I'm putting the car back together, I come to find that the frame where I had beat on it was tweaked and it didn't fit correctly onto the chassis anymore. It just didn't quite line up. It was a really snug fit. I managed to demonstrate that off camera. Fantastic. But here you can see that it's kind of taken some force to hold it in place. But that's what happens. Anyhow, I managed to work around it. I just screw the thing back together and then we move on with the build. I was really frustrated at this point and I decided I wanted to just get this banged out and finished. So I took to the hot glue gun, which normally I avoid. So this is how I'm going to attach it to the base. I just put a big puddle in the very middle of the bottom of the car, and I'm putting a little bit of the hot glue both on the underside towards the insides of the tires so it won't squish out on the outside and be as visible. So the next thing I have to do as I'm doing this is I'm being really careful to get that flat tire effect on that back right tire where I flattened it. Just making sure that I don't have a lot of glue hanging off on any other edge. Clean up a little bit of it where I see it poking out. But other than that, it's just making sure that back right tire actually maintains that flat tire look. Once that's in place and the glue's had a second to sit, I start getting the polyfill ready. And so the first part that I want to do is the windows. And I just kind of squeeze the bottom edge down to the size I want it, make sure that I can get the look I want, kind of test fit it all. Then looking at it as I had it all held in place and kind of eyeballing it, I realized that it looked too clean still. There was no smoke, no wear from where it might have been too hot or caught fire or anything. So I decided the next thing I needed was some quick paint just to kind of rough it up and make it look like there was some soot and debris collecting around where the fire was. And this was done in 2 steps. The first step was a real rough kind of prime / base coat of just plain black hobby paint. I just real heavily dry brushed over the entire area. I did make sure to get around the tops of the door frames and around where the open door was as well as all the way around the front of the hood, including across the fenders a little bit where the smoke would have been billowing out from under the hood. So once I've got that done, I just take my brushed nickel hobby paint and I'm going to do the same thing. I'm just going to do an even lighter dry brush of this. I just want to pick it out and make it look like some of the paint's burned off, kind of, you know, give it that worn, beat up look. Most of this isn't going to be visible through the polyfill smoke, but it's kind of there mostly to camouflage the bare metal where I tried cutting through the thing. That's really one of the biggest reasons for needing to put paint on it at all. Once the paint's on, I go ahead and dive straight into putting the polyfill in. So I just fill the passenger seat, since this is going to be kind of down lower and only really visible from the side and the top. I just kind of fill the seat and the floorboard with hot glue, and while it's still hot, I work my polyfill in there and kind of shape it how I want it, hold it so it's sort of upright and sitting to where the smoke is rising, as opposed to just kind of laid out the door or laid over the top of the car. It takes a little fiddling, but once I get that done, I just do the same thing over on the driver's side, and then I end up using a mix of super glue and hot glue, but I do the same thing on the hood as well. Now, when I say I use both super glue and hot glue, I don't mean I literally mix them. I mean, I go around where the cuts are that I tried to make especially, and I try to make sure that I super glue into those. That way the polyfill will stick around those unsightly, really nasty cuts the best and will hold tightly. And then I kind of go around behind that where it'll be less visible and just kind of work in a little bit of hot glue so it'll hold quicker and so it'll stay in place faster. So here I just kind of press that down into both the hot glue and the super glue. I end up picking out a little strand of hot glue that stuck to it. But as you can see, that was actually really quick once I gave up on the bad idea of trying to get the hood open. All in all, this project, while it took me almost 3 hours, 4 hours to get it to actually, you know, finish it, it should have taken me like 45 minutes to an hour, and most of that would have been waiting on glue and paint to dry. I'm really ashamed of myself how long this took. But from here, the next thing to do is to just hit it with a couple coats of matte varnish just to seal it. That'll help stiffen up the polyfiber, give it a nice solid texture, help it stick together and stay upright better. It also helps give it a little bit more wispy of a look, and the finished product I'm pretty happy with all in all. It's not what I envisioned, it's not what I had in mind when I started, but it's still playable, it still looks good. I'm not going to be ashamed to have it on my game table. So hopefully this is a good video to kind of illustrate the thinking process when things don't go right. Hopefully you learned something from watching it, maybe it inspired you to build something of your own that's similar. I'm really happy with the end result, like I said. If you guys like the video, if you enjoy the content, If you learned anything, if it inspired you to build anything, please give us a like, comment. If you have any questions, I'm always more than happy to answer questions in the comments. And be sure to hit the notification bell so you can see what we're up to next time here on the Clock Tower. Pretty sure we're going to continue building some Neo Nagoya terrain. I'm really excited to continue this project and get more stuff on the table and ready to play with. If you'd like to support us, be sure to check us out over on Patreon. Currently, that's the only place where the S.E.E.R's experimental rules are at and available. So if you want to play the game and play some of the scenarios, be sure to check out our Patreon. You can also buy us coffee through Buy Me a Coffee. Links for all this will be in the descriptions below, but of course, caffeine is always needed, and always appreciate any kind of contributions in that form. Also, if you want to support us in a different way, get something out of it yourselves, be sure to check out our Amazon affiliate links in the description below for any of the tools and materials that I commonly use in these builds. I won't be recommending the rotary tool I had. Maybe it's best to just go buy an actual Dremel. I will put a description to that or a link to that in the description below as well. Like I said, my rotary tool, not the greatest for what I was trying to use it for. We'll probably see use in other hobby projects, but just wasn't good for cutting through anything. Lesson learned. But as always, the biggest support you guys give is just watching the videos, and thank you very much for watching it. Hopefully you've enjoyed it. And remember, at the Clock Tower, it's always game time.